Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ask the Author session hosted by the International Transport Forum at the OECD. The ITF's Ask the Author series provides quick-fire, 30-minute rundowns of specific transport-related issues. This session is going out live via Zoom and is also being shown on YouTube and LinkedIn. So welcome to you all, wherever you are today. Basically, our Ask the Author sessions work like this. We invite the author of a recently published ITF report to give a brief presentation of the report's main findings and recommendations. And then we invite you, the audience, to pose questions. Today, we're going to talk about coastal shipping. The ITF defines coastal shipping as maritime transport that takes place between ports on the same continent. It's also referred to as intracontinental shipping, short sea shipping, marine highways, coastal trade, and coastwide trade. Coastal shipping receives relatively little attention from academics and policymakers, and yet it represents a significant part of the transport sector. It's of crucial importance for the connectivity of island regions and can contribute positively to regional development. However, coastal shipping must deal with the need to decarbonise, a significant development which presents both a challenge and an opportunity. Decarbonisation, coastal shipping and multimodal transport, the ITF's most recent roundtable report, outlines the most pressing challenges the coastal shipping sector currently faces and provides governments and policymakers with concrete actions to help address them. To take us through the complexities of the issue, we're joined today by Olaf Merk, a project manager with the ITF who specialises in ports and shipping. Olaf managed the ITF roundtable event on coastal shipping held last October. He'll take us through the main findings of the report, and then we'll put your questions to Olaf. If you already know what you'd like to ask Olaf, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But for now, over to you, Olaf.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all of you for joining this webinar. Hi to all of you. I will indeed try to, run you through this recent report that is called Decarbonisation, Coastal Shipping and Multimodal Transport. David already provided you with a very short summary of what's in the report. I'll try to do this a little bit longer, but short enough for you to be able to ask a lot of questions. Here on this picture, you see the cover page of that report. What you see is it has as a subtitle, Summary and Conclusions. And that is because it is, in a way, the summary of the roundtable that we organized on this same subject. There's a roundtable that took place, almost a year ago in Paris. It was also followed online. And our roundtables generally bring together a group of experts in the field for around 1.5 days, 2 days, to have very intense discussions with the different experts from different parts of the world and also from different sectors. So there were academics, there were private sector people, people from NGOs, international organizations, and of course from governments. So this report, in a way, reflects the themes that we discussed in that roundtable. It is also linked to our Decarbonisation of Transport initiative, more in particular the common interest group that we had on shipping, where we also discussed the decarbonisation of coastal shipping, where we also had a workshop that was hosted by Finland. Now, what did we do in our report? Well, we essentially looked at the main challenges for coastal shipping, and we tried to suggest some actions for policymakers to address these. So what will follow is essentially 5 slides with, 5 messages, and 5, let's say, themes, and then 4 slides with recommendations. The first theme that we discussed was, well, what is actually the market for coastal shipping, and what are the conditions of that market? It was already recalled by David. Around half of the total transported goods by sea is actually from coastal shipping. A lot of this in bulk, but there's also a substantial part in containers. One of the things that we observed while looking at the data that exists in this area is an increasing integration of deep sea and coastal shipping. For example, in the containerized sector, the global carriers are all active in coastal shipping as well. So if you look at the top 5 carriers, they're all in the top 10 of the intra-European shipping market. So increasing integration, also increasing consolidation of the existing coastal shipping operators. So again, in the container sector, what we saw is that the top 10 of the operators in coastal shipping, their market share went from 60% to 78% over the period 2006 to 2021. So an important increase, and that is also the case for some of the other coastal shipping sectors. So there is integration, there's consolidation, there's also vertical integration. So that is, the coastal shipping sector is becoming part of an integrated supply chain. And in many cases, that is also, let's say, an integrated chain that is controlled by just a few operators that are increasingly investing in the whole chain. So not only coastal shipping, ocean shipping, but also port terminals and hinterland transportation modes such as trucking, railway transport, and inland waterway transport. So that is, let's say, the context of the whole discussion that we had. So the market conditions of coastal shipping are changing, have changed. Of course, coastal shipping is also, let's say, embedded in a whole, let's say, multimodal chain of different transport options. We already mentioned that earlier. And in that chain, there's a key role for ports to actually make sure that there's a good interconnectivity between these different modes, so that there is a real multimodal, let's say, freight transport chain that is effective. I already mentioned vertical integration and the vertical integration that is happening. And what we observe that this, well, has different effects, mixed effects in a way. It can be a double-edged sword, if you like. At the one hand, it can increase the interconnections within a door-to-door transport chain, so it can make sure that these are better connected. But on the other hand, they can also limit the choice of different transport options for shippers, because in many cases they will be confronted, let's say, with 1 or 2, maybe 3 packages of let's say of an integrated supply chain, instead of a lot of different options in a lot of different modes that could be combined according to the exact wishes of a shipper. What we identified as one of the main challenges for coastal shipping is decarbonization. One of the main challenges because there's a lot of investment that needs to be made, and it's hard to do because a lot of the investments are long-term investments. So it is in many cases fixed for a long period of time. Of course, there's been a lot of work on the decarbonization of shipping, and what we observed here is that there are actually quite a lot of differences between deep sea shipping and coastal shipping. They do not have always the similar decarbonization perspectives. So there are arguments where certain advantages that that coastal shipping has that it could actually use to be a front runner, but there are also challenges that coastal shipping has, which make it more difficult to decarbonize. We can talk more about that if that is of interest. I just leave the point here. The real important point I'd like to make is that coastal shipping could be a promising testing ground of emerging technologies, and that is something that we have seen throughout history. Actually, in many of the new technologies were first tested in coastal regional shipping before they were actually applied on the intercontinental shipping markets. That was the case with steam, with containerization. That was the case with LNG, and more recently, we've also seen that with electrification and a lot of the new alternative fuels. So coastal shipping is an important sector where a lot of these innovations can be tested before they are rolled out to deep sea shipping. And that links coastal shipping also to regional development. Of course, there's always a link between shipping and the development of regions, whether they are urban or non-urban. And a lot of the regional development perspectives change, of course, depending on what type of regions we're talking about. But decarbonization will, in a way, disturb that whole or distort and that whole picture, and could transform this regional development potential of coastal shipping. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially, that it can be also an opportunity for regions to use the potential of, let's say, greener coastal shipping as something, as, let's say, a regional development opportunity. So many of the alternative fuels require a lot of renewable energy, for example, and there are, of course, already now certain regions that are trying to take that as an economic opportunity to, well, for regional development that will also benefit the coastal shipping markets. So that is, let's say, a process that is ongoing and that goes, let's say, both ways. And finally, we had a discussion on the liberalization of coastal shipping, more in particular on what is called the cabotage, maritime cabotage. So that is the let's say very short distance coastal shipping, in particular the maritime transport between different ports in the same country. And what we have seen is that there's a large variety of different practices, from very close to very open, and that a lot of the reforms or attempts to reforms are very difficult. So there's actually rarely any reforms that are successful or that are very radical. We have put this discussion on maritime cabotage in the context of what I told you about earlier, the increasing maritime concentration that is taking place. And of course, there are arguments for liberalization of cabotage regimes. It could stimulate competition. It could also stimulate better services. But of course, it could also create a situation in which local monopolies or oligopolies are replaced by global or monopolies or oligopolies. So that could be one of the reasons why many different countries are hesitant to actually reform their cabotage market. The idea that it might be a local monopoly, but at least that is something that they have leverage on, whereas if that is going to be replaced by a market of global operators, that is also, in a way, a monopoly. They might have much less leverage to actually regulate that. This leads us to one idea that, well, first of all, that of course there needs to be good competition regulation, but also that if there are cabotage reforms, that they could actually be linked, be conditioned on certain conditions, for example, decarbonization. And I'll tell a little bit more about that in the different recommendations that we have formulated. Our first recommendation is to include coastal shipping in national decarbonization policies. We observed that of the 194 nationally determined contributions that have been written up under the Paris Agreement. So these are, let's say, the plans of countries to reduce and how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That of these 194, only 19 were actually mentioning transport, and of course less even mentioning the coastal shipping. There's also the possibility to submit national action plans to the International Maritime Organization as a way also to show what are the national actions. For the moment, there have been 7 of such national action plans. So the idea is that countries could do more, could also integrate coastal shipping in their decarbonization strategies. There are different things that could be part of that strategy, so different tools. I noted some of them here. They could stimulate demand by reforming public procurement policies, by some of the public service obligations that exist for some of the shipping that goes to islands, for example. More conditions in subsidies. For example, we only give subsidies if there's actually clearly decarbonization goals related to it. And the phasing out of fiscal disincentives for zero emission energy sources. In many cases, there are now fuel subsidies that, of course, put a lot of the zero emission energy sources at a disadvantage. So that is the first recommendation about coastal shipping in national strategies. The second is to reduce the investment uncertainty. So that is, a lot of it is about international, let's say, policies. So that is about ambition levels, that is about global carbon pricing schemes for shipping and global fuel standards that we have talked about in other reports. But it's also about the conditions under which national governments will support investment in infrastructure. And there's, of course, a lot of infrastructure that is related to the decarbonization also of coastal shipping. For example, the refueling, the recharging of equipment in port. So the idea is that governments put more clarity into what are they willing to invest and under which conditions, and also are they going to try to recuperate some of the investment. Third recommendation, to harness the regional development potential of coastal shipping. So in essence, that means to align different strategies, planning processes of different actors. So that includes ports, regional authorities, and other relevant stakeholders. And the final recommendation is about competition, to strengthen the competition of enforcement generally, but also trying to leverage maritime cabotage regulations. So, for example, to link the liberalization of some of these regulations to conditions for local or regional development and decarbonization. For example, you could think of exemptions from certain cabotage restrictions for zero emission ships. So 4 different recommendations based on, let's say, a discussion of 5 main elements in the report. I'll leave it here when it comes to the presentation. And of course, I'm more than happy to answer any question that you would have.
Thank you so much, Olaf, and a very thorough presentation of the report's findings. Now, we're moving on to the Q&A section of today's webinar. And just a reminder, if you'd like to pose a question to Olaf, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We already have one question here from Haralaus. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if not. Haralaus asks, we now have the revised IMO strategy on greenhouse gases and the new EU legislation on the emissions trading scheme, Fuel EU Maritime, and so on. How do you think that coastal shipping and decarbonisation, or the decarbonisation of coastal shipping, will be impacted by these new initiatives?
Yeah, that's a good question. In many cases, well, it depends, of course. I mean, this has also been the let's say the difficulty in our report, because if you talk about coastal shipping, it is essentially, let's say, one word, two words, but it actually covers a lot of different sectors that are not in entirely the same situation. But if you look at a lot of the new regulations that are now in place, some of the coastal shipping clearly will not be affected by it. So, for example, if you look at the EU ETS, or there is a certain threshold above which ships are included in it, but quite a lot of the coastal shipping will actually be under that threshold, so will probably not be affected. Also, when you look at the discussions within the IMO, a lot of the regulations there are about international shipping, and in a way, of course, coastal shipping can be international shipping, and it can be between, let's say, shipping between two different countries that are in the same continent. For example, we would consider that to be coastal shipping. But it can also be coastal shipping, well, let's say, within the territorial waters of a country. So that is also the reason why we thought it would be good to show how national governments also have leverage over that sector and can actually also do things. Because if we are all going to look at, well, the IMO, or if we're all going to look at the EU, we're actually probably also forgetting about some of the shipping sectors that countries actually also have leverage over, and where they can develop policies that can help that sector to decarbonize.
Thanks very much, Olaf. I have a question that I'd like to ask you. In the sort of the scene setting section of the report, you kind of paint this picture of growing concentration, of growing vertical integration and so on within the shipping sector. Can you give some examples of that growing concentration in coastal shipping that have been observed over the past few years? Yes,
so already you've mentioned the case of container shipping, where we see that the 5 largest global container carriers are also increasingly active in containerized coastal shipping, and we see that in the intra-EU market, where, let's say, the 5 large global carriers are all in the top 10 of the let's say the market share of the intra-EU coastal shipping. And what we have seen is also that a lot of these carriers have also recently invested in, well, either in more ships to do these kind of routes, or they simply brought up a lot of the existing, let's say, coastal shipping operators that were active in, well, different parts of the world. That is containerized shipping, but we've also seen that in other shipping sectors. So there's also increased concentration, for example, in what is called the ro-ro sector, so the roll-on, roll-off sector. So that these are ships where trucks or cars can, well, essentially go on the ship and then they go off the ship. So this includes, for example, ferries. There as well, we have seen increasing concentration. So what that means for me is also that, well, there are fewer actors, that could be good or bad, but also the increased integration between deep sea and short sea also means that, well, let's say there is going to be, let's say, one integrated chain more and more that a lot of shippers, so cargo owners, have to deal with. Thanks, Olaf. I'll get back to a question about the differences between coastal and deep sea shipping in a moment. For now, we've got another question here from Igor. Igor is working on a project looking into decarbonisation of inland
and coastal shipping. And as part of that project, they have noticed that the number of pilot applications of innovative technologies aimed at decarbonisation in coastal shipping is relatively low compared to the number of projects or pilot projects for inland shipping. And Igor asks, do you think that this is the consequence of coastal shipping being under the radar, as it were, of regulatory incentives?
Yes, I suppose that could be one of the answers. I suppose also if they're going to be part of, let's say, increasingly of the larger global groups, then in a way it's going to be taken care of by those groups. And then some of the sectors, well, might actually also be fairly advanced. So what we have seen in the ferry sector, for example, in the north of Europe, a lot of the, let's say, the pioneers in the electrification of ships and battery-powered ships, etc., has been taken up there, and this is really something that has increased over the last couple of years. So maybe the picture is a bit mixed. That sometimes there might be, let's say, less pickup of certain technology, but then others actually more.
Thanks, Olaf. And that question was sort of, about the contrast between coastal shipping and inland shipping. To get back to this idea that you talked about in your presentation of the challenge of decarbonising coastal shipping and deep sea shipping, can you give us a little bit of a taste of the differences or the contrast between those two sectors in terms of the decarbonisation challenge?
Yes. So you could say coastal shipping has certain advantages when it comes to the possibilities for decarbonisation. I think there are at least two. So the first is, of course, that generally it is about shorter distances. So what that means is that, let's say, the need for well, refueling or recharging well, can be done well, quicker, because if the distances are shorter, that means that you need maybe less space in a ship for batteries or for fuel tanks, etc. So that is one advantage. The other advantage, I think, is that these are all regional or local markets where one or two governments actually have more leverage. So, for example, you have a ferry connection between Denmark and Sweden, then it essentially requires, well, the agreement of Denmark and Sweden to develop something, to invest, to harmonize, or whatever. If you're talking about global shipping, then certainly you have, you're talking about, well, 190 countries or more that need to somehow to agree on regulation. So these are two advantages. There are also two difficulties, I think. One is that coastal shipping, there's more competition with some of the land transport modes. So if it becomes too expensive, there might be a tendency maybe to shift back to trucking, for example. A second difficulty is that that some of the coastal shipping sectors have more direct links with customers. So, for example, the ferry services. This is a difficulty, but also actually an opportunity, of course, because that means that if there is a very large consciousness of emissions among the public, among the consumers, they will push, of course, for greener ships, and that is also something I think that we have seen in some of the Scandinavian countries.
Thank you, Olaf. We're just about run out of time. Those of you who are participating online will have noticed that I've launched a little poll asking for some very brief feedback from you on the format of our Ask the Author series. Always keen to make sure that we're reaching the right people and that we're presenting you with the information that you need. So thank you to those who've responded. My final question is about your final recommendation, as it were. You talk about the role or the possible role of competition authorities in decarbonising coastal shipping. Can you tell us a little bit about why that recommendation is in the report?
Well, essentially, it is simple, right? It is just looking at what is ongoing in several of the shipping sectors. So that is growing concentration, not only let's say bigger companies, but also with the vertical integration that we talked about. And at the same time, we've done this in other reports, and so it wasn't really, let's say, the core of this report. At the same time, we noticed that there is actually a little bit of a, well, let's say, you could say, a vacuum when it comes to global regulation of competition of shipping. So there's no global regulator. There are different countries that have, well, different sorts of regulations. There's not a lot of coordination between them. So when it comes to a global sector that is becoming increasingly concentrated, this is starting to become a problem for a lot of competition authorities. And that is when you think of liberalizing a lot of the cabotage, which is now, of course, still a lot of the national shipping. We thought it would be important to take that into account, that as long as you have, let's say, not a competition regime that can actually effectively monitor and enforce, well, regulations for a global sector, maybe you should also be careful in opening up markets that are now national, but that could become global, and where you could have the same problem of difficulty of regulating it. So that is essentially why we thought it was important to link let's say the discussion on competition also to coastal shipping.
Thank you very much, Olaf. And thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. I've found it very, very informative, and it's a shame that we don't have an extra 30 minutes because I have a whole bunch of other questions I'd like to ask. If you haven't already downloaded the report, please do so. You'll find the link to the report in the chat, and you'll be able to look back on this presentation via our YouTube channel in due course. Once again, thank you for joining us for our Ask the Author webinar today, and wherever you are in the world, goodbye for now.